Gentlemen, thank you for coming on the Easy Prey podcast today.
Thanks for having us, Chris.
So,
Thank you.
can each of you give a little background about who you are and what you do?
I'm Philippe Desmaris. I'm the CEO of Kelvin Zero. I set our strategy and our vision for where we're going at the company. My background, I've had a front row seat at both uh, highly regulated business and government settings throughout my life, and I've studied criminology. I've worked in business, and I've always been very close to technology. I've worked in data companies. I've worked in remote management of hardware company, and now Kelvin Zero.
Awesome.
And in my case, I'm Thierry Gagnon. I'm CTO of Kelvin Zero. Philip and I co-founded a company 5 years ago together, basically following joint acquaintance, I guess, at the time, Philip, that kind of put us in touch, and then we eventually discussed cybersecurity and got along quite well.
Awesome. Did both of you have, like, was cybersecurity your plan coming through your education, or was it just kind of where your careers went?
Thierry
So
is an expert in cybersecurity, so I think his career definitely was cybersecurity. I've always been fascinated with crime, and I've and computers, and so one thing just led to the other, and meeting Thierry and developed that passion with Thierry.
yeah, and then in my case, I don't know, cybersecurity, like, it may have been a calling. Like, I remember my parents had the Commodore even before I was born, and I just I was born with it, and kind of started playing computers and then tinkering with things over time. And as I grew up, and really got hooked up in security after watching the Hackers movie, and maybe a few months after it got released. I was 10 at the time, quite young, but it kind of got me hooked, and kind of consider it for a long period of time. I evolved into I fiddle a bunch of different things in the 90s, basically, in security. Really like anything freaking. Not so much experience with it, but definitely looking at designs and building some of the blocks that you could find online at the time. And got to a point where in school I had to make a choice as to what I was going to pursue as a career. I looked at computer sciences. Back then, there were no real specialization or
Yeah.
classes or courses or anything in security. Decided not to go down that path. I ended up in human kinetics, completely different horizon from computer sciences. Being training people and looking for high performance, but then that kind of joined back when I decided to actually go back to school and take on computer sciences. Um, and basically, that was prompted following an injury, and that made it hard for me to kind of pursue the athletic path. So I played video games in between the two, and I got to be kind of a very, I'd say, fairly well-known individual into the esports scene, where I was basically the title was chief referee for the game Counter-Strike.
Hmm.
And one of the tasks was to kind of defeat cheating, and going all the way back, cheats in the mid 2000s were actually quite advanced. If you look at what they were doing from a cheating perspective, some of the malware threat actor groups right now are just barely getting there. So it got me into the cybersecurity path following that.
We're definitely kindred spirits. As a kid, had a Commodore 64, and
There we go.
back in the post-college days, my roommate and I spent probably way too much time and money playing Counter-Strike.
Well, I was lucky to stay away from spending too much money for it, but ideally making some with it. But ultimately, yeah, I think it gets you to gets you into computers to some extent. I think gaming, and yeah, at least for me, the
Yeah, we both had custom built computer rigs that were like, okay, what's the best graphic card that's going to work with this game and not that game? Yeah, it was
yeah.
it was a fun time, and a lot of things have changed since then.
Yeah, no, definitely.
So let's move our discussion into passwords. I don't. Do you guys have much of a history an awareness of the history of passwords?
I mean, we've been using it for a long time, right? When you think about it, knowledge base secrets in general, whether it be in digital system or not, it's been around for millennia at this point. So from a historical standpoint, it's something that we definitely have an interest in, but also as to the use that we can apply these principles into our daily lives, whether it be again in the digital or in the physical world. Those are two aspects that we kind of look at in general and say, well, okay, can we actually improve on this?
Yeah.
We like as I think as human beings, we like to think we're getting smarter. I think we often confuse being smart with being faster.
Yeah.
Or not necessarily even being faster, but simply having a bigger throughput from different ways, and basically being able to brute force our way through things in life. And we often overlook the smarter way to do it. So password being something that interests the fleet, Philip and I both, that's something that could be changed, could be addressed, could be improved, definitely.
Yeah, I'm one of those back in the days that you had the one password that you, not one password, but a password. I have to not use trademarked words here. Had a password that I used for everything, probably like everybody did in the late '90s, and it's been very interesting to see how the landscape has changed and the realization that uh, maybe in those days, maybe we had two or three systems that we had to remember a password for at most, and nowadays it's hundreds, is probably even on the low side for many people.
Yeah, from a statistical standpoint, I think depending on what research you actually take your numbers from, but it typically range over 240 on average per individuals. So yeah, it's quite a lot.
Yeah, and that becomes well beyond a human's reasonable capacity to manage in a way that's actually safe.
I'm not sure what you're saying here. Like, who reuses password, right?
Yeah, yeah, and so like, what kind of
But I
problems
think the
does that get
challenge
us
from a
into?
human standpoint, from a
I think we dropped a connection there for a moment.
well, obviously there's the whole management aspect that you covered. Oh, sorry. I mean,
Wait,
you
let,
back.
let,
Can
let,
you
let's
hear me now?
reset. Let's reset for a second because we're someone is either I'm lagging
Yeah.
or you're lagging.
Could have,
Okay, go again now.
I don't know, it could have been on my end. Yeah, I was saying so. So you definitely have the management of passwords is something is obviously an issue just by the sheer number of different credentials that we need to carry around. But there's the whole problem of really a password not really being um, something you really need to know specifically, right? When you think about it, is just an evaluation of value, and as long as the input value actually matches, uh, the expected outcome of hopefully a hashed and salted password, you're in. And so we often believe that when we talk about authentication that we have um, different factors of authentication and that the knowledge based ones such as the password are actually attached to knowledge, but in reality they could also be attached from old attacks as pass a hash or things like that have been exploited in the past, kind of highlight the fact that it's actually not all that much anchored into the knowledge of the individual, and that's if you have the right individual of you in front of you, sorry. So
Yeah, I mean, if I'm using a password manager, is the password really knowledge anymore?
well, there we go. And the thing is it knowledge or is it something you have?
Yeah,
Again, do you have it?
it,
Um,
it definitely, when there's a password manager, it's definitely moved to, I guess, your second factor, so to speak, is something that you have because, well, there's a button I press that regurgitates something that I don't know what it is.
exactly. And then even when we say something you have, really, with some of the services that are out there that runs it as a SaaS and actually kind of store the passwords for you, Or you don't even have it anymore. All you have is then you may have a single factor password that you use to log into your password and manage on that service that then regurgitates some things for you. But if these sources gets compromised, and that has happened, we've seen everything around the LastPass breaches. What do you do? When did we think it was maybe a good idea to kind of centralize everyone's password in a single place, have it in someone else's hands? And then use this as the way to actually provide authentication for all the other resources we can think of an individual can access, right? And for us, when you think about it, at that point, it may almost be as secure if you were keeping it into your, desktop / super secure file, don't read.txt type of thing. And I that's what I meant earlier when we said sometimes we kind of confuse being smarter and versus being faster, and reality here kind of shows that we couldn't compromise password at scale when people were writing them on pieces of paper, and definitely not on a remote setting. Nowadays, though, with some of these services that are out there, that can be done remotely. It can be done at scale. It can be done at machine speed, basically. And it can be done on such a large scale amount of users that it makes it a no-brainer for threat actors to target these systems.
Yeah, and that's so. Have the threat actors gotten smarter, or have they just gotten faster? In the same way.
I think we've made them faster. We've enabled them to be faster. Have they gone smarter? I think they're just as smart as what they were. And I think one of the paradigm that exists in cybersecurity, and that we at least at Kelvin Zero are really focused on trying to change, is that when you look at the cat and mouse game that takes place into cybersecurity, the attackers really can play it like it's something that's been mentioned in your podcast like several times. Like it's a numbers game, whether it's scam, whether it's cybersecurity, it's the same principle. The attackers needs to be right once.
Yeah.
And they'll probably make their ROI for a pretty long period of time. The defenders needs to be right 100% of the time. And we need to kind of flip these odds around for it to be, really useful for us to kind of build an economy that's going to depend on the digital world and kind of bridge a gap between the physical and that digital world. And then this is something that's hard to achieve. And are they getting smarter? I don't know, because typically the approach in cybersecurity is to try to come up with generic solutions that solves a lot of different problems. The reality, though, is if you have a good adversarial mind, you will find the gap that you need to find to get into pretty much any system. And given enough time and resources, it's game over. I don't believe in unhackable system or anything like that. And just by experience and different things that I've seen, spent a whole lot of time in the federal government in Canada doing cybersecurity work. There's no limit really.
Unhackable systems are kind of like unsinkable boats.
Yes. One doesn't go without the other, technically, right?
Famous last words.
Yeah, exactly. Unless you're a great swimmer.
Yeah.
But ultimately, I mean, there's no such thing as an unhackable thing or system. And it's a fallacy to really think that there is. And again, when you do think you're safe from anything, you're just asking someone to come up with a more creative, unique solution to the one problem that they're given to try to target you and compromise you, versus you having a very broad, yes, maybe multi-layered, but generic approach nonetheless. And you're probably not going to be able to cover all the edge cases that someone can come and attack you with, right? So the attack surface that is available is unthinkable and unfathomable for most users, and that's where it's costly, especially if we're comparing organizations versus individuals. This is a striking difference.
Yeah, I know we were talking before we started recording that individuals are not in a place to be able to manage anything beyond basic cybersecurity. I mean, it's like, yeah, I've got to, we're lucky if people are using two-factor authentication or
Mhm.
you're lucky if that's the case. You're lucky if the person installs an update on their phone within a month of it coming out, let alone their printer, their router, their television, their refrigerator. The individual is not qualified in many cases to be their own cybersecurity specialist.
Mhm. Correct. And the default approach that a lot of companies are taking is not to secure the user first, right? They're really in it for what they want to grab from the user first, and then they're going to move on to, oh, here's an option if you know about it, if you know what you're talking about, that you can maybe hope to improve your current standing. Not necessarily get secure, just improve your current standing.
Yeah.
Um, and no matter what you do as an individual, the reality is, as an individual, you're not going to have your own SOC running 24/7 to monitor what is happening about your home network or any of your resources you may be using in your daily lives.
Yeah.
And and that's a problem.
So what's the solution or what's the direction to move?
Well, ultimately, that's a great question, right? I think when we look at password, I think one of the approach definitely has been to kind of move away from them, right? To go a more passwordless approach. This is something that we kind of work on ourselves on a day-to-day basis. And there's different approach to do this, but the approach, regardless of the actual way of using the technology or a product or a service that you could be applying, is how are you actually going to be able to put it in the hands of the right people that can provide a level of trust that can be recognized both in the physical and digital world, and that from there they can actually kind of distribute it and put it in the hands of their end users or customers or employees, whatever you want to insert here as a term, but ultimately have them be secure by default, right? And a lot of people have been talking about secure by design as a way of developing technology, and it's great. But again, like, I've been a software developer for a long time now, specifically in cybersecurity for over a decade, doing software development. And what does secure by design mean? Like, it's not something that's concrete and clear for even people that are looking at this and working in that field on a day-to-day basis, per se. Like, we get the principle, yes, but like the reality is that this is pretty much never the option that a software development or a company is going to take when they actually build a system. And we believe in a different approach, that where if you are secure, then you actually enable yourself to do much more than you can in the current ecosystem. And I think this is something Philip can speak of a bit more on the business approach as to what can be done, and how different companies could be working to actually really improve the overall cyber posture of the economy.
I think one thing that's rarely discussed, even when you talk about passwordless or just cybersecurity in general, is that if you do it properly, it presents a huge opportunity because it's such a massive problem. And if you can protect end users, and you can know who the end user is with very little uncertainty, then actually the world is your oyster. So what's stopping a bank from innovating? It's the regulation.
Yeah.
They're scared of being in violation. And part of that is knowing who's on that other end. And so when you talk about something you have, if I can take that, then now I'm you.
Yeah.
And so that's a big issue. So the opportunity side is where I always look at, especially when you're talking to these businesses, because it's not true that it's just a cost center. Cybersecurity is an opportunity. It's an opportunity to innovate and to have the freedom to innovate and go after the type of business that you want to be, instead of being reactionary and having to shut off opportunities from, where big tech is eating your lunch. because they don't have the same types of regulations.
What are some of the examples of where big tech has less, I was going to say more freedom, but let's call it less regulation versus a financial institution or a medical institution?
Well, if you just think about in the financial services and the identity of how they play their game, no one has better identity data than the banks. And what are all the fintech companies and the big tech companies doing? They're trying to get that data, right? So you see pushes towards open banking. You see pushes towards all of these different solutions where we can aggregate the different credit cards that you have or the different banks that you have. I can start formulating an idea of who you are, whereas the bank can't really play that digitally. They have to be very cautious about their application and how that application interacts with third parties and all that type of thing that the customer has decided they want. Rightfully so. The innovation is there, but the protection and the security level is not there yet. And so that's the delta in the competition. And what ends up happening is once a big tech company can offer you a multitude of banks on a channel and they can serve you that, then actually the bank just becomes a utility. Yeah. They're just, which bank is going to serve you the lowest interest rate or whatever it is, financial product, the best financial product. Choose that one this time, choose that one this time. I now own the brand. I own the customer. And that's really the problem. This passwordless is so much more important than just passwordless and security. It's who owns the end user at the end of the day. Who owns that relationship?
Yeah. Who do you think are I can think of a couple. Who are the big players in trying to get in to owning the relationship? I think first and foremost, we think Google as a big player of trying to own that, and Facebook to some extent. I'm not sure that they're as good, nearly as savvy at it as Google has appeared to have been. What are some of the other players that are trying to own us in that sense?
Well, there's a few different fintech companies that play this game, right? Where they're trying to aggregate this data, whether it's Mint or whatever it is. I can't speak that that's their exact game, but these are the big players that are doing that. Apple has Apple Pay as well. They want to know what's going on your credit cards and see what payments are happening. They say they're private, and sure, they're private, but not to the level of a bank.
Yeah. So what do we do about that problem?
Well, this is a bit of the reason why Thierry and I got going. So we fell into where we're at with Kelvin Zero, but essentially what we're really after is ensuring trust in the digital transaction. And we want these highly regulated institutions to have that relationship with the end user. We don't want any of the information. We want to create a system where they're able to identify who's on the other end of that transaction with very little uncertainty, where they can decentralize the control of their tech stacks so that the end user has less clunky interface to work with. It's very complicated when you have to then call and validate who you are, and you're going through these different levels and procedures of the bank. And then in order to do that, you have to be able to have the privacy and all of that jazz that comes with it. And so what you need? Well, you need to have accountability and governance. And this is a really key piece is the physical world versus the logical world has a difference here, and it's that they're able to in the physical world, they know who I am, they've got the relationship, they're able to see that. In the logical world, I'm just entering here. I could be who I am, I could not be who I am. We really don't know yet. So with Kelvin Zero, what we're trying to do is we're trying to give them that logical world that creates the physical world, where you can not only identify who you are. But then you're able to transact freely with all this different opportunity that is presented. I'm sorry, I'm not sure if that's clear.
I'm not sure if it's entirely clear, but that's
Well,
true.
maybe we can edit it out.
Most emerging technology is not clear to us.
So,
Thierry, do you want to take a better run at that?
Yeah. Maybe one thing that to mention, right, is kind of as what Philip mentioned. In the real world, it's we have a process of identification, right?
Yeah.
Which is not really something that exists in a digital world. We have somewhat of a digital ID, which a lot of people would kind of refer to. Really, if I water it down, maybe, but it comes back to your usernames and your online identities. That's what I'd like to call them. But it's not so much, again, like the reputation that you have on someone really being the person that you think they are, regardless of the claim, and if they can authenticate against the claim that they make, which then that's the authentication part, is not something that really exists today, right? And there's all sorts of different ways to track users across different sites, across different platforms, across different devices, across different networks, and to a point where, in reality, when you look into this, and that's where it gets involved with the privacy side of things, is we've had cookies. Kind of people are going away from cookies. We now have network IDs, and when you look at the tech stack that an individual uses, whether it be in the corporate environment or not, right? If you are running a computer, and something that's I've noticed recently, for example, if you do run something even on a VPN, and you're using Chrome as your browser, for example, or any of the browsers that are attached to the big tech companies out there, they'll be able to tell that you're not connecting from the same IP, but that it doesn't match the actual user that's not necessarily even logged in, just the actual device ID fingerprint that they have based on the browser they use. Now, this is something that's not really new for someone in tech world, but from most users out there, they're wondering, right? When they say, like, oh, I was talking with some friends, and I've sent messages over Facebook Messenger about a given topic, and then I'll have that ad, and they're listening in on my conversation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, maybe they are, but even if you turn it off, the reality is people have a hard time understanding how these different organizations are able to get the information back from either the software or services you're using, because they don't understand how they work. And that's just the unfortunate reality. I think technology is moving at such a fast pace that most of the population is kind of left behind, not understanding how it can be used against them to really benefit these different corporations, right? And their business, and they're after their bottom line. That's okay. That's what they should be doing. But at the same time, we're not necessarily setting the grounds up for truly world-changing technologies that could be spurred if we would have a bit more security and a bit more privacy in general, right? When we get into the medical space, which is something that we're interested in, how do you convince people to share medical data?
Yeah.
To kind of better either care or treatments that can come out of research on online technologies, when there's breaches left, right, and center, where some companies will use that information to market you something, and then you'll be like, how did they know this? And you can't do the 1 + 1 = 2 in this case. And the end result really is just a less than ideal outcome versus what we know we could be establishing if we were just actually giving a bit more of that control that Phil mentioned earlier, relinquished it from a business model standpoint almost to the end of the user. And the reality is also this, right? Everyone in the world is always in cooperation in one way or another.
Yeah.
When you use a bank or when you use any service on the web, it's not just the service that is doing something. It's not just you that is consuming something. It's bi-directional, right? It's always two ways at the minimum, if not more. If you deal with a bank, they typically deal with thousands of third-party service providers that will have access to your data. That you basically give that right away, right? But just managing that is a challenge. So how do we get to a level of providing a way for individuals to be able to navigate these waters safely and not compromising on security and privacy for more convenience, but actually trying to get both. And that's ultimately the real answer, right? Is to be able to put it in the hands of people that have no incentives in actually abusing that relationship, and relinquish it a part of the control and put it in the hands of the user, so that every steps is part of a cooperation process, basically between the two ends, whether it be client and server or end user and service provider.
Isn't the kind of the always push against that is going to be the business that is looking to make additional profit margin, in the sense of like, well, I've got this medical data. My organization is struggling financially. If I just sell a little bit of this, then I can pay my corporate bills. And so there's always this push against, well, yes, it's in the best interest of my customer to never sell any of their data to anybody, but that's not in the that's not in the interest of my shareholders who want to see corporate profits.
So, there's a big aspect of acceptability in this, right? Where I think most users want privacy. But what is privacy, right? Is privacy anonymity, or is privacy not allowing anything to be done or known about you? Or is privacy maybe a bit more lenient, but getting to a place where you should at least have the control to allow or stop it whenever you want, to be able to use your data, and actually have to force deletion, let's say, whenever there's no law that prevents it from it being deleted, obviously. And for you to be able to say, well, that was great. Like I love these tailored advertisement on my device for a little while, but you know what? I'm ready to move away from those, and I'd like you guys to get rid of my data for you not to be able to target me all that much anymore. Where's the problem in this, right? And I think a lot of organizations would be able to, and I believe there's a market for privacy. I mean, we're all here talking about privacy and security for that very reason. Is I think some people are actually definitely into the market of making sure that your data is protected and not mishandled, and actually use how you intended it to be used.
Yeah, like thinking from the medical perspective, if I go see my doctor, I want them to have the history of my heart rate from my smartwatch. I want them to have the history of the scale that I stand on every morning, the history of the water bottle that tracks how much water I drink. And when they tell me, hey, we need to send you to this specialist, I want the specialist to have all that data. But as soon as the specialist says, your treatment's done, I don't want that data sitting at the specialist anymore. I want to, like you said, kind of retract it and put it back in its nice little box where it's safe.
Yeah, and that's an ideal that I think most people would agree that should be their ideal. And so, if that's the case, well, we just need to find a way to actually monetize that aspect.
Technology should serve us fundamentally, right?
Yeah.
It should do what we want to do. If I go see a doctor, back in the day, I'd bring my file with me, and there we go. Today, it sits there, and then it's there, and it's duplicated everywhere, and I don't remember where everything is.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then someone exploits a medical API somewhere, and now they have it.
Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah, and it's that's in the press you often hear of these stories and breaches of very high profile organizations, but the reality is we've done a quick analysis very quickly at Kelvin Zero a long time ago of what would be the ideal targets to get most information about an individual. And if I target a travel agency or service, and let's say car dealership, I have pretty much everything about you except maybe medical history.
Yeah.
How many of these organizations do you think are running a proper cybersecurity program?
Yeah.
Why would I waste time to even go after the big targets? And you think these guys will notice they've been breached? Yeah, and it's an unscalable problem because we outsource IT more and more and more towards these big tech organizations. They
Oh, we lost you.
attracted talent into the isolated environment doesn't make it appealing for individuals and talent to actually end up working in some of these regulated environments. Why? Well, I'd rather go to the big tech companies because these guys are doing something cool, something big, something flashy ultimately, right? And so how can you attract talent to really serve all these different organizations when there's a shortage in cybersecurity? It's been something that's been said for a long period of time, and there's a shortage of talent for any job at this point in
Yeah.
time.
And the flip side is I don't want my travel agent having to be a cybersecurity expert. I want them to spend their time and effort being the best travel agent that they can be. And, the cybersecurity, I don't want to say it takes care of itself, but like where they don't have to worry about that, and to have the confidence of I can provide my service and I don't have to worry about people stealing the data, people breaking in the back door, getting access to the bank accounts,
That that's why we're working with highly regulated institutions. We want to enable them to be able to serve all of those groups and validate end users as they go across the economy. They control the economy anyways.
Yeah. So what are some of the ways that you can start validating people other than usernames and passwords and one-time pins?
So basically, and that goes back to what exists in the real world that does not exist in a digital world, right? And it is to kind of create that fabric of actually creating an identification system that doesn't necessarily have to match to your personal information, by the way, right? Like we know how to use pointers in programming. Why can't we use the same principle to have access to tokenized data about an individual, but actually know that it's a specific individual, that someone somewhere has a record, and knowing who that is? You can sit with the government. The government knows your identity anyway.
Yeah.
They're the one issuing it to start with, right? It's like at that point, whatever. What you don't want is you don't want your government to be spying on you and tracking every little move that you're doing. However, if they're just a provider of a tokenized version of your identity and someone else keeps the record of what you've done with them, and if they need to prove it by law, well, they have the proof. That creates basically a pseudo-anonymous, at the very least, identification system that can be based off cryptography. And if you pin that and you anchor that with something, and this is where we kind of get into what our approach is, anchor it back to an authentication system as well as a verification on the client side, the user side, pre-authentication to a server. Then you get to a level of actually being able to minimize at least repudiation of an identity of a user that's using something without actually having to know who that user is, which in my mind would be an ideal, or at least a very interesting offering for creating a system. And then you can move on, and because you have that in place, then you can move on better authentication system by default. You could have MFA by default. Why is that not a thing? Like you would be surprised even how many enterprise systems right now, IDP and IAM solutions in general, that actually force you, even if they offer passwordless offering, they force you to still enter a password to start with.
Yeah.
Yeah. For a little, kind of like what you were saying about the routers earlier when we were discussing recording. You can be breached before you actually put the security measure in place. Ultimately, now it wouldn't act that fast if you take it out of the way. But the only real reason why this is the case is because there's some genius at some point that said it's a mandatory field in a database, because back then all we were doing was password-based credentials.
Yeah. It's we're stuck in that reference point,
basically. And so moving away from it actually kind of, I would say, kick the can at least a few meters out, a few feet down the road, basically. And when you get to something where, okay, well, can we actually address the problem of having single factor authentication? For sure is something that I think is probably a bit more known than into moving into multi-factor solutions. That's great. That's a good first step, but also getting away from the problem of being only the server authenticating you. because then, what it's all going to do is it's only going to shift the problem to the organization doing the authentication.
Yeah.
When they get compromised, it's a start over.
Yeah. Oh, it's a very interesting world. I mean,
And
in some sense, it's good that we can have these conversations and not. I would say we've probably waited too long. Not the three of us here in this moment, but I think as a technological society, we're behind the game, behind the times, behind where we need to be. Yeah,
for sure,
in this
for
sort of
sure.
space.
And we've avoided and we kicked that can down too many times, basically. And now we're so far from where we started and have the chance of actually fixing some of these problems at their roots that, we've just been patching all along. But, even as a kid, if you're building a sandcastle as high as you can, at some point you're going to have to improve your base.
Yeah. Yeah,
Otherwise, it's going to
a
crumble every
pile of
time.
sand is not going to get you 100 feet high.
Or you're going to need a very, very wide, very broad pile of sand at its base, and then you're going to have to build it up gradually on top, right? But we built it, and then we kept building on top, and we may have to go back down at some point and say, you know what, let's address some of these issues at their roots and build on top of that to allow us to do all these great ideas and use cases that we think we could be achieving, but that would have an issue being either adopted or would have some ethical concerns from a security standpoint, from an ethical standpoint. And, we everyone wants to move fast. Technology wants to move fast, and it's going to move fast regardless, right?
Yeah.
And one of the concrete approach that we can use to actually address some of that problem I mentioned earlier, if we were to create a system that allows for a pseudo-anonymous identification without at least sensitive information being exchanged or shared, you could still profile someone, you could still sell something, you could still improve your margin as a business. But then you don't run the risk of leaking that personal information from your client to someone else.
Yeah.
And biometric is one such way to kind of pin back and anchor back the persona with the client side verification that happens pre-server side authentication. And but even then we see some organization kind of moving and just building these massive centralized biometric databases, which are just bound to get compromised one day. And then what? You just ruined it for everyone that was using it?
Somewhere in my mind, I seem to remember a sci-fi movie that whenever you needed to authenticate, you had to do a pinprick of blood everywhere that you went.
Yeah. Well, I mean, sci-fi movies are actually kind of great for that sometimes. They kind of predict the future, and we actually built our product called Multipass from the fifth element idea here, of that little card that does everything in a movie. Like they can pay with it, they can log in with it, they can get into VIP parties on whatever spaceship they're on. Sorry for all the Fifth Element fans here if I guess this is a reference, but the idea is kind of this: how can we avoid the mistakes of the past and move past that into the great ideas that we have today that we want to see in the future, right? And I think when it gets to biometric, this is something that we need to really take time to take a good look at. Yes, there's ethical reflections on it, but there's bad approaches that we know already should just be avoided altogether.
Yeah, and a lot of that comes down to, well, I immediately start thinking of AI camera training data and having to, okay, how do we separate ourselves from our cultural and ethnic biases and have a wide enough a system that works for everybody, not just people who look like us and sound like us.
That, and I think we need to have the reflection as to, okay, well, what biometric technology can be used for what purpose, right? I think actually let's say facial recognition is great at doing identification without actually revealing necessarily some specific sensitive information about an individual. I think it's a terrible way of doing authentication though. Why? Because content actually creates solutions to bypass these systems are readily available. Pictures of and videos of individuals are readily available anywhere on the web these days. You got your starting, the equivalent of what used to be a dictionary attack, or basically a start to get into the rainbow tables way of how we used to break passwords back in the days.
Yeah.
So we just basically went 30 years back in time, starting over, this time with biometrics, something that's going to be much harder to change than a password, which we were already pretty bad at changing whenever we changed it. Right.
Yeah.
Oh, did I say that?
So if there's one in the current system and way of doing things for consumers, I'm just trying to whittle it down with a where consumers today, what you're doing is awesome, but it's not in the hands of consumers yet. What's the one data point, one system, one point of identity that they're at the most risk of, that they really need to put the most effort into maintaining and securing?
Well, I mean, I think we see a lot of governments already talking about digital ID initiatives, and they're already in place in some different jurisdictions, different countries. Others are working on them, and some are just looking at what others are doing and kind of waiting, and they do a wait and see, and they're going to reevaluate after a bit of time. I think this is definitely one aspect where individuals needs to pay attention, because it's most likely going to become that de facto way of identifying yourself in the digital world, and maybe even in the physical world, where people are not going to rely on physical aspects that we used to be able to leverage, and actually only rely on the technology to do it and trust it. So I think that's one of the aspects that we kind of need to look at and make sure that they're well secured, and that the principles that are used to build that respect privacy and respect security principles as a foundation. Now, in terms of actual solutions, let's say for an end user, that what can someone do? Well, I think my view on this is kind of similar as what we were mentioning on password managers, right? Like let's not go full circle and go either one way or the other, right? If we have a fully centralized system that does that, it's bound to be a massive target, and it's a matter of time of what's the ROI for me to be able to compromise it.
Yeah.
And it's just gonna eventually happen, right? On the flip side, if we go fully decentralized, well, okay, well then it doesn't really offer great, as we were mentioning, cooperation, right? Like the reality is the identification process always happens again with at least two entities. The person that wants to get, let's say, identified, and I say person, could be an object or a system. And then the actual party doing the identification itself. And in reality, you're only who you are because you're recognized as who you say you are.
Yeah.
And so if no one recognizes you as such, your self-issued ID has very little value. And so it's to look for these solutions that are going to be in the middle. And I'm not necessarily here to do a massive pitch on what we do or anything like that, but I'd like to think that ultimately, a solution that would kind of strike a right balance somewhere in the middle is the answer.
Yeah. No one location for all the control, so to speak, or all the data.
Correct. And I would go even as far as saying no one point of single point of applied control on these aspects of data.
Nice. As we're wrapping up here, we went longer than we thought we were going to go. Any wrapping up, a parting advice, and then we'll talk about where people can get a hold of you and where people can find out more about what you're doing.
Philip, any advice on your end? Or
I think you're muted.
I think he may just be uh, out of breath or something. But no, I think as an advice, I mean, listen, there's we won't repeat it enough. Please go away from single factor authentication. Please go away from password if you can. There are solutions out there. We do offer a solution. Is it really available in the end of consumers? No, just request it maybe to some of your regulated institutions, as we mentioned, right? Whether it be healthcare, whether it be financial institution, whether it be your government or anything else, really. They're actually out there. They exist, and they can be integrated into a much bigger fabric than the typical let's say, authenticating solution that exists right now. I would say let's try not to mix highly sensitive information with leaky device, and that's typically a step that a lot of individuals have taken. They're using they're using cloud services. They're using phone-based storage as the place to store everything, right? And actually maybe look at solutions that offer you, instead of having a cloud-based password manager that manages your vault for you, well, maybe you store a backup to your key that unlocks something that you have across your different devices yourself, but that you manage. And it can be very simple. Set up as a way for you to unlock some of these credentials, right? And again, it doesn't have to be a password. I think biometric is can be quite useful. Again, be where you use it, where it's stored, because you're not going to have a second chance changing your mind on this one. And once it's done, you're owned.
Yeah. I kind of think of maybe the analogy of online backup is great, but if what you're backing up isn't encrypted,
Correct.
it's vulnerable in multiple places now. It's backed up, but it's vulnerable.
Correct. And even when encrypted, right? If kind of all gathered all into the same place, threat actors are going to go after that. They're going to see that very easily. It's going to create a massive target for them. They're going to find a way in. They're going to take that. You may be okay. You may be getting away for it for now. It's time. It's a matter of time. But ultimately, some users that would have dependent on that encryption, hoping that it would be strong enough, are going to get breached. Why? Because the key to use was not strong enough, for example, or for any other reasons. Ultimately, it's going to be hard. As opposed to if you have it, and that's where we need to be in between the decentralized and centralized aspect. If your backups are decentralized in such a way that you're not going to be able to compromise every individual in the whole world using that authentication service backup, because they're individually stored in separate places.
Yeah.
But only have the authentication, not server, not the storage of these credentials, that's a bit more centralized or streamlined. Then you kind of strike that right balance of not making it easy to steal everyone's credentials, but also making it convenient for users to be able to do, from a user standpoint, almost an SSO across all the services they're using.
Nice. So if people want to find out more about Kelvin Zero, where can they go?
K0KZERO.com. That's our website. They can look us up on LinkedIn. We can probably provide the link for you guys to find it from the comment of the podcast. Feel free to get in touch. I'm always in for good discussion. As you can tell, it can be chatty. But we're usually having a good time.
Awesome. We'll make sure to link to Kelvin Zero, as well as each of your guys' LinkedIn profiles in the show notes.
Perfect.
And thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Thank you for having us, Chris.